So I've been doing this for almost 30 years now.
When did you become the county beekeeper?
I became the county bee inspector in 1990, I believe. And I was the last county bee inspector in the state of Colorado, and that position was retired in the year 2000. It originated in 1891. First beekeeper in Boulder County was a man by the name of David Likens. David Likens arrived in Colorado in 1859 with the first herd of purebred shorthorn cattle. He had a couple of colonies sent to him, shipped to him from a relative back east. So he was a beekeeper for a number of years, but his interests were mainly practical. He had fruit trees and a garden and things like that, and he wanted the bees for pollination. There were no bees here. They're not native to North America, so the early farmers had to bring them in. And they were first brought across by the Pilgrims in about 1662 for the same reason, for pollination and as a source of beeswax for candles. They migrated naturally through swarming somewhat ahead of settlement. Because of that, the Indians called them the white man's fly, and when the bee appeared in an area, the Indians knew that the settlement was not far behind. But the high plains stopped that natural migration. There were no natural nest sites. There was only a short period in the spring where there was sufficient forage, so they never would have come across the high plains on their own. We've associated with bees for thousands of years. It's probably one of the first things that we exploited, our ancestors, thousands of years ago. Think about it. Our diet at that time was probably pretty uninspiring. Think of what place something like honey would have held in that diet. So we've exploited the bees for years and kept bees in a rudimentary fashion, going all the way back to the Egyptians. And the honey primarily was reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. Until 1851, when a man by the name of Langstroth was working with bees. He was a beekeeper, and he, along with others, was trying to figure out a way where the bees could be managed more effectively. And Langstroth observed that in a natural situation, the bees will leave a more or less even spacing between their combs. Now, their combs might wander and have curves, but the space between the combs is roughly 3/8 of an inch. I describe it as the room it takes for two bees to pass back to back on adjacent combs. It's their working distance. So Langstroth reasoned that if he created a wooden frame and put the honeycomb inside that frame and kept all the free space in the hive at 3/8 of an inch, that for the most part those bees would leave those passages open, and he'd be able to do just what we're doing right now, which is to take a frame out, take a look at it, maybe move it around, look for the queen, do all sorts of things. So he designed a hive on that principle, and it worked beautifully. And it was the foundation for all of modern beekeeping worldwide. This is the propolis. It's a resinous substance that they get from tree buds. If the space is appreciably less than 3/8 of an inch, the bee's response to that is to fill that gap. And what they use to fill that gap is the propolis. So propolis is sort of their all-purpose caulking, varnish. They'll put a fine sheen of propolis on all the inside parts of the hive, on all the woodenware. They'll tighten up the hive in the fall for winter, fill cracks, and sometimes fairly large cracks with the propolis. The propolis has antiseptic, antibiotic properties, so in addition to having those physical characteristics, it helps to sanitize the hive and keep it healthy. Boulder County, at the turn of the last century, was one of the leading beekeeping regions in the United States. It was a major agricultural industry here at the turn of the century, and carloads, train carloads of honey were contracted for each fall and left towns like Boulder and Broomfield and Loveland and Fort Collins and Berthoud. At that time, Boulder County had 8,000 colonies of bees in the county and a population of 21,000 humans. Today we have somewhere between 500 and 700 colonies of bees. In the old days, a bee inspector would randomly inspect beekeepers' colonies. He'd show up at your door and he'd say, "Joe, I want to take a look at your bees." And Joe would take him out to the bee yard, and he might take that colony and this colony and that colony. And he'd look for foul brood. And if he found foul brood and it was serious, they'd go in the burn pile. I took a little different approach because it's an unpaid position and I didn't have the time to go around and inspect everybody's bees, and the professional beekeepers had pretty much disappeared from the scene. The approach that I took was one of education, to try to educate the beekeeping community as to the concerns over the various diseases, and foul brood is one, and be a source of information for those people. The biggest problem has been the appearance of two parasitic mites that showed up in North America in about 1987. We had a serious problem in Boulder County when the mites first showed up. One of the consequences of the mites was not only serious problems for the beekeepers, but about a 90% decline in the feral colonies. Ones that had escaped from management and occupied the walls of old buildings and hollow trees and things like that. It was those feral colonies that filled in the blanks between the beekeepers. And of course, with 8,000 colonies of bees in 1900, Boulder County had an enormous legacy from those days of feral colonies that occupied almost every available cavity. When the mites showed up, that first year I started to get calls from people who knew little about bees, but knew that their apple trees, for example, should be humming with activity when they were in bloom, and they weren't seeing a bee. The result of that has been that my winter losses have gone from 2 to 5% in a normal winter to 30% winter after winter after winter. Bees have a life cycle the same as butterflies. People are more familiar with butterflies. Well, the bees have the same life cycle. The queen is the source of all the eggs. She lays the eggs, and it's an egg for 3 days. Then it hatches into a tiny little larva. The difference is that larva can't go out and forage for itself, so the bees have to care for it. And it's the youngest bees that are the nurse bees. And they care for that larva over a period of 7 days. For the first 3 days, they'll feed it a substance called royal jelly that I call high-octane baby food. They consume a mixture of honey and pollen, and they have glands in their jaw which produce this milky substance, and the larva literally floats in that royal jelly for the first 3 days, and that's the food source. The larva grows very rapidly, and then it begins to stretch out along the length of that cell. At the 4th day, they start feeding it honey and pollen directly, and on the 7th day, they will cap it off. That brown, what looks like shopping bag paper, is actually a breathable form of beeswax. Inside that cell, the larva will spin a cocoon. It pupates for about 2 weeks, and then it emerges as an adult bee. Normally, a colony of bees would only tolerate 1 queen. And a lot of the activities of a hive are influenced by the scent of the queen, or the pheromone. The scent of a second queen will result in 2 things. The bees themselves, the workers, will see her as a stranger, and they will kill her if the queen doesn't get to her first.
You have one very sluggish bee emerging from
That's a drone. That's the male bee. They have a pretty good life if they're born in the early part of the summer. They just hang out, eat honey, and cruise for queens in the afternoon. Their only purpose is to be there in the event that the colony needs to produce a new queen. But the day of reckoning comes in another 2 or 3 weeks when the nights start to cool. The colony recognizes that they don't need those drones in the winter. So the drones that are remaining in the colony will be ejected from the hive in the evening, physically dragged out, and the guard bees won't let them come back in when the temperature drops that night. Then they chill and die. The environment benefits. Within a mile to a mile and a half, I've had a number of experiences where I put a bee yard into a location where the returns were very, very minimal, but I left them, and over time the production would increase because they're out there cross-pollinating a multitude of things, improving the quality of the environment.
What else besides apple trees benefit from pollination?
Well, the general rule of thumb is that the bees are the foundation for about 1/3 of the American diet, about 1/3 of American agriculture. All of the melons, the cucurbits, the cucumbers, pumpkins, strawberries, apples, cherries, peaches, and indirectly the bees are responsible for the pollination of a great amount of alfalfa seed, which is the seed source for those farmers that grow alfalfa to feed their beef cattle and dairy cattle. So I always compare them to the oil in the engine, a seemingly insignificant part until it's missing. And we're on the verge of losing this industry, and we could very well see a horrible crisis in the next few years. So these are the honey supers. Now, the deeper boxes are the hive bodies, and that's their year-round home. It's only the surplus that we harvest, and the deal that the bees and I have is I provide for their welfare. They do much better on their own with my husbandry than they would on their own, and they're able to produce beyond what they need to take them through the winter. They get theirs first. It's only the surplus that I harvest. That's new honey. The part above is filled. The nectar comes in at about 70% moisture. So one of the things that the bees have to do is evaporate that moisture. The other thing that they do is they invert the sugars, changing it from a complex to a simple sugar. That's why digestively honey goes into your system so quickly. And then each of those cells, once that nectar is converted, each of those cells gets a little wax cap. The ones along the lower edge of the frame haven't been quite finished yet. We organized the Boulder County Beekeepers Association in 1975 in response to some very serious pesticide kills the previous year. And I was one of the founders. It's a focal point for the beekeepers. It's probably the largest and most active beekeeping association in the state. One of the things that we did is we created a beekeeping class through the county extension office. And we've done that for 5 years now, and we've graduated about 120 people, not all of whom have become beekeepers, but that has helped to recharge the ranks of beekeeping in Boulder County. The future of beekeeping in Boulder County really belongs to the hobbyists. It's funny. I don't know of a beekeeper who wouldn't like to have someone else do the extracting. They'd rather just keep the bees. But at the same time, yeah, it is very gratifying. It's a wonderful craft. There are a lot of frustrations. The American beekeeping industry is on the verge of extinction if we don't start making some changes. And but it's very gratifying. Everything we do is beneficial. And in the end, we produce one of nature's finest delicacies. So I wouldn't give it up.